Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we will begin the program tonight. I'm Bill Hyland, and I am your parish historian, and it's been a great pleasure and privilege for me all these years to serve the people of St. Bernard Parish. Of course, I began working many years ago with Frank Fernandez, whom some of you knew quite well. And lately, before I get started on this, I've had a great challenge to face. Although we had a termite contract on Ducros Museum and Library, it turned out that our service provider was incompetent. So last year, we found evidence of termites in Ducros, and it came back this year. So we got into the project, and $60,000 later, and we actually got away rather reasonably, we have stabilized the house. Ducros Museum was built before 1800. It's one of only 12 structures, or one of only 12 sites individually listed in the National Register of Historic Places in St. Bernard Parish, and I have to say that it looks better today than it ever has. So we've been busy with that, and then I thank those of you in the audience who took the time to come and visit with us for our very first Fiesta Filipina, which we had Saturday, October 12th. By 3 o'clock, the food was almost all sold out. But we had over 1,000 people. Some of you, as I said, in the audience were there. We really appreciate you coming. And so we look forward to having it again next year. So I've been tilting with the windmill of historic preservation in St. Bernard for many years. And one of the areas that I first became interested in, other than, of course, the eastern part of St. Bernard, where the parish began, was Arabi. And indeed, one of the founding members of the St. Bernard Historical Society, who was a courtesy aunt, Marion Roy Ducros, had wonderful stories to tell about Arabi, and it so intrigued me that after I started working with Frank Fernandez, we tried our best to do things in Arabi, and of course at that point the people who lived in the neighborhood objected to having a National Register historic district. They objected to having a local historic district, but that was fine. You know, they owned the property. It was their decision to make, not mine or anyone else's. So over a period of time, much was lost in Arabi. But then because of the Merrow Foundation and because of a new group of people who have moved into Old Arabi, much of what remained has survived miraculously Katrina. So let's see now if I can figure this out. There we go. Can you imagine this? This is the Newbury map. The original of this map is in the Newbury Library in Chicago, Illinois, and actually it would fill about half of the exposed area of this stage. We believe that it was made in 1723. The date is uncertain. It was never dated, nor do we know the author, the actual person who drew this map. But it is the earliest map showing the fledgling city of New Orleans, which is right here, and then 50 leagues above, going upriver, all the way to the German coast, and then 50 leagues below, going all the way to English Turn, and down to this area, which is today Stella and Promised Land and Merry Plantations. So it's really interesting. And you know, one of the things, for years we've always thought that this was English of the two earliest, this is the earliest map showing Arabi, what would come to be known as Arabi. And the upriver concession had been granted to different other Custillas and different other colonial people. And then finally in the 1740s, it was granted to Jean-Baptiste d'Estrahan. And of course today we call d'Estrahan d'Estrahan. His son, Jean-Noël d'Estrahan, built d'Estrahan Plantation. But actually, the original concession was in what we call today the Lower Ninth Ward, beginning at Flood Street and going all the way to Mealy Avenue in Arabi. And then the next concession belonged to Henri Leblanc de la Croix. And he actually was an absentee landowner. He was an official at Versailles, never saw Louisiana. He had people who ran the plantation for him. And beginning in the 1720s, about 1723, as a matter of fact, it was 1723, one of the first indigo crops in Louisiana was planted at the Chalmette battlefield, which belonged to the brothers Marais Dupuis and Marais de la Tour. And so by the end of the 1720s, indigo was the major cash crop that was planted below the city of New Orleans. And so it was the first major cash crop in what is today Arabi. Now, how many of you know what the indigo plant was used to make? That's correct. That's why there's indigo blue. And believe it or not, there is a species of indigo native to the Mississippi Valley, but it really is more or less a weed. And whenever you first clear a field, the indigo comes up. That does not make a good quality blue dye. And actually, the indigo plant that made the blue dye that was so very successful was from Saint-Domingue, which we call today Haiti. And so the process was really a difficult one. The white people who worked with it and the enslaved, for the most part, died very quickly because of the toxicity of the process of taking the indigo plant and converting it into dye. So, let's see if we can go on to the next one. This is Pierre Rigaud de Vaudreuil. He was the fourth or fifth governor of French colonial Louisiana. He was one of the Quebecois, one of the people from Quebec, who actually carried a title. He was a Marquis. The Lemoine brothers were the children of Charles Lemoine, who was the Baron de Longueuil. So those were two of the very few titled Canadian French families. And Pierre Rigaud de Vaudreuil came here in the 1740s, and he purchased the Henri Leblanc de la Croix tract. And he also cultivated indigo. So I think it's fascinating that one of the colonial governors of the state well then the colony of Louisiana, actually owned a plantation in what is today St. Bernard Parish in Arabi. And he was very popular. He was a very, very talented administrator. However, unfortunately for him, after leaving Louisiana, he returned to Quebec, and it fell to him to surrender Quebec to the British. And he finally left Quebec and he died in France. But a very fascinating, very effective governor. He was very well thought of, and he brought with him to Louisiana from Quebec Delino de Chalmette and Denis de la Ronde and Olivier de Vezin and many of the families that we recognize in Louisiana today. So very fascinating man. So here we have an image of a subdivided part of the Rigaud de Vaudreuil plantation. He actually left here in 1750. In 1749, he entered into a contract with Antoine Bienvenu, or as we pronounce it today, Bienvenue. But anyway, Antoine Bienvenu is an ancestor of mine, and he's an ancestor of thousands of people inside and outside Louisiana. And a very fascinating man. He was born in France. He settled at a place called Kaskaskia. Kaskaskia was near the confluence of the Ohio River and the Mississippi River. And of course, in the French period, the Ohio River was called the Belle Rivière, the beautiful river. And for those of you who know the Ohio Valley, it is a beautiful river. But in any event, Kaskaskia actually rivaled and in some ways surpassed New Orleans in size and also in terms of its wealth. And the wealth in Kaskaskia was rooted in the fur trade. So anyway, Antoine Bienvenu, having done well there, decided that he would come to Lower Louisiana. And so he purchased the plantation that extended from Mealy Avenue to almost the Chalmette Slip. And so that was the lower part of, and the largest part of Arabi, what we call Arabi today. And then he worked the plantation as an indigo plantation. His wife was Marie-Marthe Chauvin de Vance. So, of course, she was related to the Chauvin de Léré, to the Chauvin de la Frenière. She was a descendant of Jacques Chauvin, who is the progenitor of all the Chauvin in the New World. So, in any event, he died in the 1780s, and his widow lived well beyond his time. She died in the early 1800s. She ruled the family with an iron fist. And she was a very formidable force. Her husband, not only was he a successful fur trader and planter, he also was a member of the Spanish Cabildo. He was appointed to the Cabildo in 1769. The Cabildo in New Orleans was not only the municipal authority of the town of New Orleans, it was also the court of last resort in Spanish colonial Louisiana. So one of the things that I found very interesting recently, Antoine Bienvenu actually was one of the alcaldes serving in the Cabildo who signed into law a provision in the late 1770s that provided for the mutilation, if you will, of men who committed heinous sex acts. And I find it interesting that his great-great-great-great-great-grandson, Governor Jeff Landry, this session signed virtually the same bill into law. So you see, history repeats itself here in Louisiana. His mother, Jeff Landry's mother, was Edna Bienvenu, and I had met her. She was a lovely lady, always very interested in the history of the family. So in any event, this house, we believe, was the house of Antoine Bienvenu. This house actually stood on the property that ultimately would become the LeBeau House. And you can see this was painted in 1852 by Eugène Surgi, S-U-R-G-I. He was a surveyor, and he was also a structural engineer. So anyway, a beautiful house, and you can see it bears all the hallmarks of a mid-18th century Louisiana home. The dormers, you see how small they are. And then it's called rez-de-chaussée, meaning that it's raised on pillars. And this was a style of architecture which evolved in colonial Louisiana in reaction to the frequent flooding that we experienced. So, and then you see the beautiful trees and all around it. And of course, remember, by the 1850s, this house was already more than a century old. This could even have been Rigaud de Vaudreuil's house. So anyway, I wanted to show that to you. I think it's just really fascinating. You see where the house was, the cabins for the enslaved people. So let's go to the next slide. Now here we have a map from La Carrière-La-Tour. La Carrière-La-Tour was Andrew Jackson's chief engineer in the Battle of New Orleans, and he actually mapped the entirety of the area which was invaded by Great Britain in Louisiana, and then he also mapped the Gulf Coast, showing all the areas where the British made contact with Louisianians from Atchafalaya Bay eastward all the way to Pensacola. But here you see the area that was occupied by the British. This is actually the extended field of battle in Vermilion. And actually, this is very interesting. Forgive me for walking away. This is, let's see, this is Bienvenue d'Aran. So right here would be the cafeteria of Chalmette High School. And then this street right here, this is the levee in 1815, but guess what this is today? Ohio Street in Chalmette. So in any event, very interesting. And then also you see here, this is the next map that really shows Arabi. This was an encampment that General Jackson built behind the main line of battle, which was here. This was the line Jackson. But the next line was up here, and this is today more or less the site of Jackson Barracks. And there are those military historians who believe that Jackson, having encamped additional troops there, helped to decide the location of Jackson Barracks. You can also see here this canal. This is the Canal des Pêcheurs, the Fisherman's Canal. And from 1817 until 1875, this was the westernmost boundary of St. Bernard. This was the boundary of St. Bernard between St. Bernard and Orleans Parish. One of the daughters of Antoine Bienvenu married François de Léry. So that's why this is shown as de Léry on the map. And then, of course, if you come all the way down, you come to Terre-au-Vieux. And, of course, this is the original St. Bernard Parish right here. The riverfront did not become St. Bernard Parish until 1817. So that means that when the Battle of New Orleans was fought in 1815, it was fought in the parish of Orleans. So as we go on, now this is the next important map. This was done by Charles Zimpel, and as I recall, I think it's 1834, 1836. I think it's 34. And there are several original copies of this map, and believe it or not, the original map takes up the entire size of this screen. The Historic New Orleans collection has a copy intact, and so does the Southeast Architectural Archives at Tulane University. So in the larger map, there's a cutaway of downriver, Orleans, and St. Bernard Parish. So here we have, this is Versailles. So this is by definitely 1834. Here you see the house, the parterre garden. This is the Delaronde house. And then you see the trees behind, and then the trees going to the river. And this is the first map, by the way, that shows those trees. And then as you move up, this is the Bienvenue plantation. This would be Antoine Bienvenu, the son of Antoine Bienvenu, actually had this plantation. And then all of these strips of land here up to Prévost and up to, and because actually even Cantrell, and we have Cantrells in the audience tonight who descend from this Cantrell, and Villavasso. This is actually the Chalmette battlefield right here. And then, of course, what had happened, Delano Chalmette owned the plantation at the time of the battle, but he lived very exuberantly. And he he was not very careful with his money. His half-brother was Denis de Laron. Denis de Laron was another story. He was very much the pater familias. He was a brilliant military man. He was an accomplished planter and business person. But of course, Chalmette was his brother, and so he would loan money to him. Well, in 1815, the sugar crop was destroyed, and that really was all that Chalmette had. He did have some funds, but not very much. So unfortunately, in order to stave off his own financial destruction, Denis de Laron had to foreclose on his half-brother. And that's when Hilaire and Michel de Saint-Amand, who were free men of color, purchased the entire Chalmette plantation, and then they are the ones who subdivided it. So in any event, we'll move up now to Arabi. So Arabi by this time is, let's see, we begin here with Darcantel. This is Benoit Tremé. And then in 1834, here is the Fisherman's Canal. So that's the, that's the boundary at that point between St. Bernard and Orleans parishes. Now note the name Benoit Tremé. That's very important right here. He was a son of Claude Tremé. And of course, it was his father who had purchased the old Demarant tract, which had been granted in the 1720s to Vincent, the Chevalier de Morand. He was from Normandy, and he established the very first brickyard and tile factory for the colony of Louisiana in the New Orleans area. Claude Tremé married Julie Moreau. Her family had come into possession of the Demarant tract. By the late 1700s, Claude Tremé could tell that the city of New Orleans was growing, and that it was going to grow not only upriver as it already had, where the central business district was, but it was going to grow downriver where Faubourg Marigny started. And then he also knew with Bayou Road, which ran in back of the city, connecting the city of New Orleans to Bayou Gentilly and Bayou St. John, that the whole city was going to explode. So he began subdividing the Tremé plantation, and then he decided that he would move his entire family downriver from New Orleans. So by the 1850s, a good 75% of the bricks building 1850s and 1860s New Orleans came from the lower Ninth Ward and St. Bernard Parish. But it was Claude Tremé who inherited the faïencerie that made tiles for houses and bricks. It was Claude Tremé who actually took that venture from where it had been in the 1720s and planted it here in St. Bernard. So for instance, the Roy family had the Maison Jalousie, which was part of the Bienvenue tract. Well, that was a brickyard. The Darcantels had a brickyard. The Charbonnets had a brickyard. Alexandre de Lesseps, who had part of what we had purchased, the Urquhart tract, that he had a brickyard. So, and of course, who was Alexandre de Lesseps married to? Eugénie Tremé. And then tonight in the audience, we have Eric Schmidt, and he is a direct descendant of one of the sons of Benoit Tremé, and he's a direct descendant of Claude Tremé through the Reese family. But in any event, so it's a small world down here, whether it's Marignys or Livaudays or Delérys or Tremés or Moreaus, we're all related. So I just wanted to show this to you and give you some background because I just think that's fascinating. Even François Deléry's grandson, Jules Deléry, who is Bonnie Cook's, many of you know, great-great-grandfather, he had a brickyard just above Jackson Barracks. So anyway, let's move on. Stock landing. So let's talk about stock landing. It was Arabi Post Office Stock Landing, Louisiana. And so what had happened is this. In the 1860s, the New Orleans Benevolent Butchers Association purchased part of what had been the tract that had belonged to François Delarue and his wife, and later Benoit Tremé. And there had been a working brickyard there. Well, the brickyard had fallen into disrepair and disuse during the American Civil War. So it was decided that they would purchase this tract of land, and half of the tract of land was in the parish of St. Bernard, half of the tract of land was in the parish of Orleans, in other words, New Orleans. So the Butchers Association purchased the land. Esteban Street was opened for $800 in 1869. It was paved with Belgian blocks. We have the contracts for it. I could have shown it tonight, but I didn't want to. There's so much to show, so much to tell, so much detail. It's fascinating. So in any event, and then later, originally Esteban Street was named Slaughterhouse Street, but later it was named for Paul Esteban, who was actually a Gascon Frenchman from the French Pyrenees, who was a butcher and president of the Butchers Association. In 1870, the property was sold to the Crescent City Livestock Landing and Slaughterhouse Company. And then the Louisiana legislature granted a monopoly to the Crescent City Livestock Landing and Slaughterhouse Company on all slaughtered beef and swine in this part of Louisiana. So that made that slaughterhouse absolutely critical to feeding this entire region. So here we see a part of the 3rd District of New Orleans going down into St. Bernard. This map is from about 1900. And let me see if, I wanted to go back, sorry. And if you see right here, this is a map of the slaughterhouse in St. Bernard. This is what we call the abattoir, and this was in the lower 9th Ward. It was built later. But here is the slaughterhouse right here. So, and then as we move on, that's actually what went on in the slaughterhouse. And you can imagine the smell. But I will say, though, that some of the very earliest refrigeration was found in that slaughterhouse. And as a matter of fact, the slaughterhouse was responsible for bringing more rail service, the first running water, natural gas, telephone, telegraph, and electrical services to St. Bernard Parish. So even though there was a price to be paid for having that slaughterhouse, it nevertheless brought many modern conveniences there. And this is actually what the slaughterhouse looked like about 1880. And this is actually facing North Peter Street. Can you imagine? And then I'll show you this. This is the lighthouse for the slaughterhouse. Here's the river. This lighthouse, according to Marion Roy Ducrot, became the St. Bernard Voice office. And if you'll look at the lighthouse, you can see how it's truncated. And so you can see that same truncation in the surviving building. And Aunt Marion remembered that they were about to set the levee back, and her father was William Frederick Roy, who founded the St. Bernard Voice in 1890. She was 12 years old, and she was so close to her father. And so she had to be with him wherever he went. So he actually was in the building when he had it moved on logs by a team of mules. And it was really fascinating to listen to her remember all these things. She was such a great lady, always very patient. That's what made her a great educator. Charles Cassar knows about educators. So here we have slaughterhouse cases, the Butchers Benevolent Association of New Orleans versus the Crescent City Livestock Landing and Slaughterhouse Company. Are there any attorneys in the audience? If there were any attorneys, you would know about the slaughterhouse cases. These cases were litigated over several decades, and the sum total of these cases was that the Crescent City Livestock Landing and Slaughterhouse Company in the parish of St. Bernard came to define legally a monopoly. So, I mean, this is a landmark decision in the legal history of the United States, and it was made right here in St. Bernard Parish, involving one of our most important businesses. And another thing that came out of the slaughterhouse was that because there had been an ordinance promulgated which prohibited the operation of slaughterhouses in the parish of Orleans. As a result, since this slaughterhouse was half in the parish of St. Bernard and half in the parish of Orleans, the state legislature changed the boundary in 1874-75 from Fisherman's Canal, which is roughly Aycock Street, to Jackson Barracks, where it remains today. But, really, I can't tell you all the families who were employed in that slaughterhouse. For instance, Joseph Momus, who was born in Tarbes in the French Pyrenees, and whose daughter married Dr. Louis-Antoine Méraud. He was one of the butchers working there. And there were so many other of the families that we knew, and names that the Cassous were people who had worked in the slaughterhouse. I just can't begin to think of all. Pierre, he was from the Hautes-Pyrénées too. All of these people worked in the slaughterhouse. They began as butchers, and then many of them advanced and became businessmen. The Cieutat, C-I-E-U-T-A-T, they were from Tarbes in the French Pyrenees as well. And they also originally worked in the slaughterhouse. So I can't tell you just how important it was. And as a result of the business that the slaughterhouse brought to St. Bernard Parish, that resulted in 1905, I think it was, in the organization of the St. Bernard Bank, which was the first local bank in St. Bernard Parish. Mr. Momus had loaned money to many people, and they said, you've been so good about loaning money, why don't we make a bank? So A.P. Perrin, William Frederick Roy, Sebastian Roy, those were some of the people who chartered the St. Bernard Bank. And that bank was one of only two banks in this region during the bank holiday that was called at the height of the Depression by President Roosevelt. The other bank was the Whitney National Bank. They were the only two banks that did not close for the bank holiday. So, it was a very solid institution financially. And all of this coming out of the slaughterhouse. It's incredible. There was also the Mississippi Club. The Mississippi Club was a raised building, galleries all around it, facing the river. And for a time, it became the courthouse of St. Bernard Parish, but it had been moved there illegally. And then finally, in the 1870s, it was returned to its spot in St. Bernard Village, only to have the courthouse burned in 1884. But anyway. And here you see from the Daily Picayune, the ancestor paper to the Times-Picayune, different other news about the slaughterhouse. I'm sorry. Now, American Sugar Refining Company, today Domino. How many of you know or knew that when that sugar refinery was completed in 1910, it was the largest sugar refinery in the world? And it refined sugar from not only here in Louisiana, but really much of it came from Cuba, much of it came from the Americas, and believe it or not, much of it came from the Philippine Islands. So it was an incredible operation, and it's still very important And actually, where these chimneys are, this is actually where the Roy House was, the Maison Jalousie. So it was terrible that we lost that, but in any event. And here you see other images. This is Three Oaks, which we lost in 1966. It belonged to Sylvain Perrault. This was the original superintendent's house. This is the Cavarac House, which we almost lost in 1984, but someone who will remain nameless at the weekend of Memorial Day, May 1984, at 5 o'clock in the morning, was serving a cease and desist on the Amstar headquarters. And it was so humorous, I guess I'll reveal I was the one doing it. It was so humorous, Armando Avai was the plant superintendent. So then he spoke perfect English to me, and then I told him who I was and why I was calling him, and he said, "Yo no hablo inglés." And I said, "Se habla español." And he hung up. See, it pays off to be an Isleño sometimes. So in any event, we still have the Cavarac House, but it's a fascinating, beautiful view of this facility. And then you could see also just how rural much of Arabi still was at this period, because this is really just before World War I. So, who do you think that is? Arabi Pasha. He was a revolutionary in the Nile Valley from Egypt and the Sudan. And it's very interesting. There was no post office to service stock landing. And remember, Angela Avenue was opened in 1869. So that was the beginning of residential development to serve the slaughterhouse. By 1882, it was a real problem. They needed to receive mail there. So finally, it was determined and authorized to build a post office on Peter Street. And so there was a contest held to determine the name of this post office. So at this point, there was this very romantic figure, kind of like Zorro, who was Arabi Pasha, who was bedeviling the British in the Nile Valley. And of course, there was still great sentiment against the British. Remember, you had all these Gascon French, you had Spaniards from Spain, you had Irish working in the slaughterhouse, Germans. So anyway, so much was written about this romantic figure, Arabi Pasha, that he won the contest. So it became, and you could see there are actually serial stories about Arabi Pasha published in the Daily Picayune, the New Orleans Times, the New Orleans Democrat, the newspapers of the period. He was highly popular, a very romantic figure. So for years, from 1882, really until the 1920s, it was Arabi Post Office, Stock Landing, Louisiana. So let's continue on. So here you see different images of St. Bernard Parish in 1906. This was published in the Parish Immigration League book of 1906. And if you look here at the bottom, this is the old Arabi post office. And you may remember it, many of you in this audience may remember it as Will Gilliot's illegal gambling facility and bar room. But there was a wonderful bar that remained in the post office, and we had taken it out along with the original counter in the St. Bernard Bank, but unfortunately Katrina destroyed all of it at the barn that we had on Aycock Street. And by the way, just let me go back. How many of you know what this is? That's the unfinished Chalmette Monument in 1906. So now, what did Arabi really become famous for in the 1920s? Gambling. So here is the premier gambling establishment of old Arabi, the High Lie, which is right here. And Joe Brown, of course, and his wife managed the High Lie. They had purchased the property from the people who had purchased the property from the Friscoville Realty Company, who in turn had purchased it from the LeBeau family, because this was all, you can see back here, here's the LeBeau house. So this was actually part of the front yard of the LeBeau property. And in any event, throughout the Depression, Dr. Merrow saw to it that anyone who needed a job in Arabi or in St. Bernard who could read and write had a job with the Browns here at the High Lie. He'd just call and he'd say, okay, I want you to hire this one or that one. And it would happen. And then after he died in 1938, Dutch Rowley, who was his chief deputy and successor, continued the same tradition. So we also had the Arabi Club, and this actually had been the house that Oliver Livaudet had originally built on Friscoville Avenue. He later built a house up here, and that house is still standing. And then you had that was the Arabi Club. This is A.P. Perrin's house. Here you had the Riverview, the 102 Club, the Crescent Club. It was really just a thriving hub of gambling. And I can't tell you what it meant to the economy of St. Bernard, particularly in such a terrible time as the Depression. But you know, the people who had the gambling casinos in those days were very different than today. Because if they saw a person who had a gambling problem, they'd send them home. It's really something. You know, I heard many, many stories about all that. So, and here you see the entrance to the High Lie on Friscoville Avenue. Until recently, yeah. And of course, here we see a wonderful property designed by Alfred Kahn, who had worked for Henry Ford. This is the Ford Motor Company assembly plant. This property is another one of the 12 sites in St. Bernard Parish individually listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Kahn was a very famous designer of industrial architecture in early 20th century United States. And of course, Henry Ford had tried to work out a deal with the Port of New Orleans, but he was unable to do it, so that's why he came to St. Bernard. And here you see the interior of the property today, more or less as it is today. You can see it's really built for the ages. It's a fabulous piece of design, industrial design of the early 20th century. And of course, it remained in operation at various times through the 20s into the 30s, 40s. Finally, in the 1960s, the Ford Company, I think, sold it, and then it changed hands several times, and then today a group of local business people owns it here in St. Bernard. And there you see the front of it. Mr. Haynes, I think, knows a little bit about the place. There you see it at the height of its use as an assembly plant. You know, it was really interesting. I was told by Aunt Marion and by other people that the parts of the automobiles were shipped downriver, assembled in this facility, and then you can still see the railroad spurs that come up to the back of the building. They would load the cars on the railroad cars, and then they would ship them all over the South. Again, a major employer. You know, for many years, the motto of St. Bernard was that it was the industrial frontier of the great Gulf South. Oh, going in the wrong way. I had to do something like that. And here we are back looking at the house that was standing before LeBeau was built. Actually, this house was here. Here is the public road. This is Peter Street. Here's your river. The LeBeau house actually was about back here. And then you'll see images of LeBeau. This is what it looked like about 1906. about the time that the Lebeau family sold the property, Louis Lebeau and his sisters. And then you can see the, let me go back. You can see the quarters for the enslaved people. And here you see the development coming on Friscoville Avenue, which was opened in 1906. And there you see the house. Here is the St. Bernard Voice. And you can see how it's truncated, as I showed you in the earlier photograph. So I really do believe that what Aunt Marion told me was absolutely correct. And of course, it's no longer the office of the Voice, but from 1890 until today, the St. Bernard Voice is still the official journal of St. Bernard Parish. And here we have the Momus High School, Joseph Momus High School, named for Joseph Momus, founder of the St. Bernard Bank, a native of Tarbes, came here from the southwest of France, from the Pyrenees, but he was a butcher there, started as a butcher here. His daughter, Anita Momus-Méraud, was the first lady elected to a school board in Louisiana, and she was also the first lady to serve as president of a school board. And she and Dr. Méraud were absolutely committed to the development of public education. They understood how important it was for people to learn to read and write, how important it was for people to become literate, how important it was for people to be able to build on that literacy to achieve greater things in life. So it's very important that that this building, which was completed in 1929, built as the first public high school. This was the first high school building in the parish of St. Bernard, and it's very important that it was named for Mr. Momus by his daughter, and he was a very interesting man. The building itself was designed by William Burke. William Burke was a member of the first class of Tulane School of Architecture. He designed many, many courthouses and many important buildings throughout the South, from Georgia to Texas. And this was one of his really fine buildings. The auditorium had, and still does have, a ceiling in the mudéjar style, meaning that it's in the Moorish style, which evolved in Spain. But it's interesting, the panels are made of bagasse, which is the remains of sugarcane, and then it was painted in that mudéjar style. But it's a beautiful space, and of course Charles is very familiar with it. He had his Summer Discovery and Academy Theater there for many years.
Which Bill helped us get through that building because it was a mess for a while.
Well, so here we are, we're talking about Momus. So here is the home of Mr. Momus, M-A-U-M-U-S. And this is the house that was built about 1824 by David Urquhart. David Urquhart had come here. He was a descendant, he was from the Northeast. He was a merchant. He was a descendant of a family of Scots nobility. And the Urquhart family still lives here. Then he sold the property to Alexandre de Lesseps. And then he had married Eugénie Trémé, who was the sister of Benoit Trémé. So they actually lived in this house. Later, she bought the tract of land which was the downrivermost piece of the Détraillon plantation, or the Détraillon concession. And that had belonged at first to John Linton, L-I-N-T-O-N, who had been a business partner of David Urquhart's. And his library of rare books forms the basis of Tulane University's Special Collection Library. And it had been in the house that stood on that ground, on those grounds. John Linton, in turn, sold the property to John Randolph Grimes, G-R-Y-M-E-S. John Randolph Grimes was from Virginia. He was a famous barrister, and it is said that he represented Jean Lafitte. So he was very colorful. He lived in a very, very elaborate style. He didn't hold on to the property long. And then the widow of Alexandre de Lesseps, who had married by this time Jacques Dupré, Eugénie Trémé, she purchased that downriver tract adjoining the de Lesseps tract. And then she wound up marrying 4 times. Then one of her children was Angela de Lesseps d'Aboval. She married Émile d'Aboval. Their house is still standing on Angela Avenue. And so in 1869, she subdivided the 2 tracts of land that she had inherited from her mother. And then, of course, the principal thoroughfare was what we call today Angela, retaining the French accenting, Angela Avenue. And one of the interesting things to show here is in 1906, Angela Avenue freshly oiled and shelled. And you know, that's one of the reasons that the streets in Old Arabi don't have curbs as you find in New Orleans, because the streets were like rural roads with shells. So anyway, let's see what else we have here. And then here at the top, here is Joseph Momus. And then next to him was Nunez. He was district attorney in St. Bernard Parish, and he actually lived in a property that was at the corner of Angela Avenue, and I think that's Pont Alba. And it burned in the 1990s, and there's a new house on the site. And then under him is Albert Estopanol Jr., who was sheriff of St. Bernard Parish. He succeeded Nemours' father, who was E.E. Nunez. E.E. Nunez, Esteve Nunez, was elected sheriff in 1869, and he died in office in 1879, and he died in office in 1909. He, to date, is the longest-serving sheriff in the parish of St. Bernard. So that was Nemours' father. And then Nemours' grandson was Ralph McDougall, who was also sheriff of St. Bernard Parish. And then Nemours' aunt was Rosa Ducrot, who was Rosa Nunez, who married Raoul Ducrot. So you see what a tangle we have here. So anyway, let's see. So that's it. Isn't that nice? I'm always reminded of a Jesuit priest who came here from Great Britain in the 1990s, and I sat through his mission. And it was very interesting. You know, the Jesuits always are glib. They always know how to present publicly. And when he concluded his remarks, he said, "Always remember, it's good to be quick, be good, and be gone." So do you have any questions? Yes.
Is it known who the architect for the Ford plant is?
Alfred Kahn.
Some of those columns look like the Johnson Wax building in New York, which was the first time they were ever used.
Well, I think Chris would probably know better because he's made more of a study of Alfred Kahn. You know, I'm the colonial person and up to the 19th century, the Civil War. But Alfred Kahn did a lot of the industrial buildings in the Northeast, and he may well have done that building. I'm really not an authority on him. Well, it's probably a building he did. He was one of the great industrial designers in early 20th century United States. Yes.
You kept mentioning the brickyards. Where was the clay coming from?
It was coming from the swamp areas behind the river ridge. You know, you had the ridge along the river, and then it was coming from the very end of those ridges and the beginning of the swamp. And it turned out to make an excellent brick. And these were fired bricks as opposed to the bricks that were made earlier that were only partially fired. And so that they had much greater substance to them. And ever so often you'll find bricks that are stamped Delery for Jules Delery or Jules Delery, or Roy for Frederick Roy, who was the founder of the Roy family in St. Bernard Parish. Yes?
When our house was flooded out in Betsy, Mr. Joe loaned us a house on Friscoville, 541 Friscoville, and we would walk to the river. Well, the Highlight Club was still there. It was very severely damaged, I presume abandoned by then. This would have been fall 65, spring 66. When was it actually torn down?
It was torn down, I think, in the late 60s. I seem to remember that. And just to clarify things, the gambling industry was going full force in St. Bernard until the Estes Kefauver hearings at the end of the 1940s and the early 50s. And those hearings resulted in the dismantling of the gambling industry in Louisiana, and particularly here in St. Bernard. Dutch Rowley was very masterful in the way that he parried the interrogation of Senator Kefauver. But nevertheless, it was the doom of the industry. And then, interestingly enough, the people who had worked in the gambling casinos in Arabi, like William Roy's, one of his daughters, his youngest daughter, Thelma, who married Mr. Lavis, I remember him, they actually went to Las Vegas and helped to found the gambling industry in Las Vegas, Nevada. So, well, I knew Thelma. She was Aunt Marion's younger sister, and she was just delightful. But Aunt Marion was very proper, a lovely lady, and Thelma was also a lady, but she was rather peppery. Someone else, yes.
Bill, when did the slaughterhouse shut down?
It actually remained in operation until the 1960s. At the very end of its period of ownership or use, it was owned by the Hodges family. Evelyn Livaudet had married Mr. Hodges, and I think the Hodges family owned it until the 1990s when they finally began selling it off. The actual slaughterhouse building stood there in place on Esteban Street. It was a 4-story brick buttress structure in the Gothic Revival style. And it actually stood there until a waterspout, of all things, came out of the Mississippi River, and it destroyed the original Arabi post office, the St. Bernard Bank building, and the slaughterhouse building. And that was the end of it all. And we had looked at different options over the years. We had hoped to do something with all of that. But the people who lived in Arabi wanted to maintain what they had. They loved their quality of life. They liked the quietness of it. They didn't want change. And one of the things that Gene Cizik, who founded preservation studies at Tulane University, and one of the things that the great Martha Robinson, who was the grande dame of preservation in New Orleans, taught me was that there will be change, and you either take control of that change and you mold that change to the image that you think is best, or else the change molds you. And that's what happened in a lot of instances in Arabi. But it's a great place today. I'm thrilled to see all of the restoration that's happened there. A lot of the new construction, I think, has been very sympathetic in scale anyway, and for the most part in design with what had been there historically. And of course, if you want to know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So many New Orleanians have left the historic districts in New Orleans because they can no longer afford the taxes. They can no longer afford the insurance. They can no longer afford the quote-unquote luxury of living in New Orleans, and they're very happy to be here with us, and we are very happy to have them. So, and I want you to know there's so much more I could have said tonight. I'm going to take your question, Chris. So much more I could have said tonight, but you know, in a short period of time, there's just so much you can say, and we really wanted to hit on the things that we thought were of the greatest significance to molding Arabi, and also to show how Arabi evolved using ancient or old cartography. Yes, Chris?
If you want more one-on-one with Bill Hyland, come out Saturday, 11 to 8. He's doing tours of different areas of Arabi and maybe.
Well, actually, let me just say, there's no maybe at all. Joe Wall is Charles Dittmar's great-great-great-grandson. Mr. Dittmar was born in Helgoland, which was that part of Germany just south of Denmark. And he came here as a German businessman, lived uptown originally, and then in 1906 he purchased a tract of land, several lots on Friscoville Avenue, which was opening, and which became the premier residential avenue in the parish of St. Bernard. And he paid $6,000 to build the house that stands today at the corner of Bienvenue and Friscoville Avenues. The contractor was Collins de Ball's grandfather, who was actually born also in Germany. Joe has all of the documentation on the house. And of course, Joe, as I said, is the third great-grandson of the builder. So the Dittmar house and then the Reichert house, which had been E.M. Roy's family home, because E.M. Roy's mother was a Reichert, lovely, lovely person. Anyway, those are the two really significant houses, two-story, architect-designed houses that are still owned by the descendants of the original builder. So Joe has graciously allowed us to see the house on Saturday. I have the key. So if you come, of course, it's free of charge. You'll get to see the inside of the house. And they've really done a wonderful job with the place. And Chris lives across the street, and what a great neighbor he's been to my cousin Joe. So, yes.
Okay, that's going to be from the sugar factory?
Yes. Yeah, we'll be leaving and we're going to begin at about 12. And we'll be leaving from there. We were going to have the Gulf Coast trolley, and I had told Katie, just don't worry about it. We'd have a walking tour of Friscoville Avenue, but then she insisted on trying to find a bus, and she found the money for the bus. So we will have a St. Bernard Parish public school bus, and which is all air conditioned and very comfortable. So we will ride in style in a school bus through Arabi on Saturday. Yes. Any other questions? Well, again, I know I've left out more, and there's so much more. I do want to do another presentation about Arabi, looking at the different houses, the architecture, how it evolved here, and getting into, again, the Dittmar house, and I'm going to see if what happens, maybe Darren Roy and the children will let us go into the Reichert house and photograph that house. Both of these houses have electric and gas fixtures that are original. The Dittmar house has beautiful, it had beautiful furniture in it. Reichert house has half-tista beds that were made by a German ancestor of mine on my father's side, William Worth, who was a very prolific furniture maker from the Black Forest in Germany. So in any event, it's really something to see if we can get into both of those houses, and at least if they'll let me get photographs, because both houses are incredibly intact. So anyway, I want to thank you so much. I hope I haven't disappointed you. And it's always a pleasure to be with you. Next month, we have a dear friend of mine whom Charles taught, I think, at St. Bernard High School. Garland Sanchez, he's black. He's from Verettville. He is a professional. He's now living in Verettville, and he is going, and his family has lived in Verettville, and the surviving freedmen's colony in St. Bernard. You know, we hear about Fazanville, terrible tragedy that we lost it. We can never forget these things in history because then they're repeated. But we also have something to celebrate, a surviving freedmen's colony, a surviving community founded by freed enslaved people. And Garland's ancestors were all the people who helped to found that community. So he's going to talk about the veterans of wars from the Civil War to the present who are buried in the Verettville Cemetery. So that will be the next program. And then in December, we have our quilting ladies coming to talk about the history of quilting, and they will be displaying quilts. And I think you'll enjoy meeting them. And then, of course, in January, we have our Battle of New Orleans Symposium. And we have a very nice group of people coming, as always. And I'm delighted to announce that Dale Phillips, who was the unit manager of the Chalmette Battlefield and really organized and structured the living history program that stood in place until 2015. Dale Phillips will be coming to speak to us. Dale left Chalmette. He established the Acadian unit of the Jean Lafitte Park, built the visitor center there. From there, he was promoted to the superintendency of the George Rogers Clark National Historical Park in Vincennes, Indiana. And then he retired as the superintendent of the Lincoln Home in Springfield, Illinois. He was a protege of Ed Barse, who was the historian for 55 years of the National Park Service. He is an accomplished military historian, so he will speak to us about the military history of the Battle of New Orleans, because many people had expressed an interest in hearing that. And I've tried to veer away from that because I felt we'd heard it and heard it and heard it. But we'll hear it again, and we'll hear Dale tell it, and he's a wonderful public speaker. I will also have you know that while regretfully the Living History group will not be doing anything on Merrill property at the Woodlands, the Park Service will be doing something. We don't quite know what yet, but they will have different programs there at the battlefield, and there will be a series of programs going on in the region. Yes?
For everyone's benefit, this coming Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, for the first time in at least a decade, our middle school students will have the opportunity to collectively visit the park and to begin to value and understand what we have within our own community. That's a real accomplishment, ladies and gentlemen. And Bill and Katie and so many, Kristen Elliott, we've been working toward building, because that's there every day in our own community.
As is our Los Isleños Museum Complex.
Needs to know and appreciate.
Well, look, I thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at future programs.